Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. Legislation and rhetoric about queer people has been a huge talking point recently in government, school board meetings, and public discourse. Since the passage of several bills limiting access to gender-affirming care, the majority of conversations happening in mainstream media have been led by folks who are trying to make sense of what they're hearing, defining words they are just recently learning, and examining the realities queer people face. But the conversations often lack the context of lived experiences and perspectives because those facilitating those discussions are not themselves queer or trans. Producer Maya Norfleet sat down to talk with Luka Cai, the executive director of the St. Louis Queer Support Helpline, also known as SQSH, and a person who can speak personally to what it means to be queer. They discussed the origins of the helpline, starting with its name, and how the nonprofit has learned and grown to support queer folks. They also discussed what Luka thinks of the hyper-visibility of queer people in this moment of anti-trans legislation, policymaking, and violence. For more, here's Maya Norfleet.
Do you pronounce it squish? Because I always say squish when I see it.
Yeah, it is squish.
Okay.
And squish, I think, hopes to give people the sense of a warm hug. And it's also a term used in the aromantic community and asexual communities to mean a queer platonic crush.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So tell me the history behind Squish, the organization. Like, when was it founded and what purpose does it serve?
So Squish, the St. Louis Queer Support Helpline, is a grassroots community-based organization founded in 2019. I founded it with Riot, my co-founder, and a couple of different other community members because we really saw the need for greater peer support networks and to address the health disparities that the St. Louis queer LGBTQI community was facing. There was a whole range of disparities from housing to food to financial to social emotional health and mental health. And we felt like even though we couldn't tackle all of these disparities, we know they're all interconnected and produced by interconnecting systems of oppression. And our main goal was to build power for our community, so creating stronger networks of community care, building capacity to tackle big systems, and to help build stronger relationships within the community.
And even within the name queer, because I know certain generations have a different relationship with that word. So real briefly, what when Squish uses queer, what does queer mean?
Yeah, great question. So our understanding of the word queer has also evolved over time, so it's really interesting. We started out using queer as meaning anything that is counter to the heterosexual or cisgender majority. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, asexual, aromantic, polyamorous people, anyone who practices a form of gender, sexuality, or relationship structure that is counter to the dominant forms that we see in society, we would say queer. But as we learn more about the history of queer, we learn two things. One is that, yes, it has often been used as a slur to target people who are different, just like other slurs that are used against the queer community, that is being reclaimed by queer liberation movements, not just in the U.S., but internationally.
Okay.
But at the same time, there's this myth, I think, that queer is a new thing. It's like young people are using it these days. Older LGBTQ people don't like it. They prefer LGBT. But actually, we know that queer has been used by organizers and activists for many years to mean something that is anti-oppressive and that is liberatory. So anything that is meant to, and so some people say being black is queer or being disabled is queer. And what they don't mean to conflate these terms, but rather they mean to stand up for and be visible about creating liberatory practices is queer. And so LGBT is not the same as queer because, there are LGBT people who are not safe for marginalized people. There are people who don't have a queer or anti-oppressive politics, even though identity-wise they're in the community.
I see.
So queer is also a politic, and I think that has become more powerful, but also has been watered down over time.
And so when Squish first started with the support helpline, what type of phone calls were y'all getting? What were the things that people were asking help around?
Yeah, great question. So when we first started, we were so much smaller. We were very unknown. Not many people knew about us.
So when you say smaller, though, how much smaller?
So we started out with an annual budget of about $5,000, and we had about 15 volunteers. So now our annual budget is more in the range of $150,000, and we have around 60 volunteers.
Wow.
So,
okay,
so
so
we've grown
much smaller.
Much smaller, very grassroots, very volunteer run, a lot of burnout, as you can imagine. But some of the calls we got range from mental health resources, housing insecurity, people looking for stronger relationships, people wanting to talk to difficult situations they're in, people feeling lonely and isolated, especially when the pandemic first hit and ongoingly. And I think people get surprised when I tell them this, but actually the calls we get now are still very similar. They're still about relationships, connection, mental health, lack of community, not being able to participate fully in communal life, and also housing is a big challenge, especially for our trans callers.
And so when it comes then to just like the scale, and now, of course, like the budget, annual budget has grown, the number of volunteers have grown. Does that mean then just the volume of calls have grown too?
The volume of calls has grown as well. But one thing, people say, how many calls do you get and field a year? And that kind of defines how successful your scaling out has been.
Yeah.
And I like to think about scaling as not just purely outwards, but depth. So the depth of the relationships we form with the community can't always be captured by the number of calls we get. And each call we get can be very long. So we're not a crisis hotline. Some of our calls end up being 2 hours long. And these are people who are really isolated often and just want another LGBTQ queer person to talk to. So I think that's very hard to measure by traditional nonprofit metrics. I think we've also grown in terms of the kinds of programs we offer and how we think about and strategize towards queer liberation. So some of the programs we run now include the Squish Book Resource Database, allyship trainings, community building events. But we've also started learning a lot about like movements that we are part of, like healing justice movements, disability justice, racial justice movements. And I think the way we go about our work has also changed a lot and centered more relationship building with Black queer folks, and also more of a sense of place within the St. Louis region, more connected to the organizing work that's already happened here. So I feel like some of those, yes, our call volume has increased by about 10 times since we first started, but also, we're nowhere near like getting the number of calls that like BHR is getting or like a national hotline is getting. But I think the grassroots connection and role we play is like difficult to capture and measure using nonprofit metrics.
It's quality, not quantity. That makes a big difference, especially when, like you were talking about, the relationship building. You can have a bunch of friends and still feel alone. It seems as if because of the rising number of legislative bills that have been put out there, that have been proposed, that have even passed, more people are realizing or maybe even just paying more attention to the different realities that queer people in this city, in this state, in this country are experiencing, and how, even what you just said earlier about the relationships and feeling lonely, there are probably people who are like, what do you mean? There's gay bars everywhere. How can you feel lonely here? Do you feel like Squish has kind of evolved with some of the needs as far as like what queer people actually need versus what the broader like mainstream culture might think queer people need?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think just like with any other community, the people most at the margins are the people who traditional systems like struggle the most to reach. And so Squish as a single nonprofit is the same, right? Like we also struggle to reach people living in rural areas, Black and brown folks, trans folks, younger people, incarcerated people, disabled and chronically ill people, deaf and hard of hearing people. There's so many people living with these multiple intersecting marginalized identities and experiences. I think Squish has made some progress over the past couple of years, especially when it comes to creating safer conditions for disabled and chronically ill queer people to engage with our programs. So really investing in how do we make hybrid and virtual programming engaging and successful? How do we make sure that chronically ill and disabled people are not left behind as people think that the pandemic is over? We also, recognize that there are very serious racial divides in St. Louis, and also racism impacting Black and brown queer folks in St. Louis. So how do we create safer spaces through trusting relationships? That takes a very long time. So I think we see a lot that Black and brown queer people are often also marginalized and more invisible within queer community.
So when it comes to building or connecting folks to community, what does that look like in practice?
I think community is often a romanticized concept, and so you hear people say that I want to be in community, or I love my community, or my community's got my back. But what we see, and we learn a lot, there's a group called the Bay Area for Transformative Justice. And one of the things they found through their pod mapping work is that they found that most people say they have a community, but when asked to actually name people who have their back, who they can go to when problems come up, or they can go to for emotional and tangible support, most people can only name 2 to 3 people. When I read this, I was a little called out. I was yeah, I can also only name 2 or 3 people.
Yeah.
And so I think what that points to is community is not a pie in the sky concept. It takes a lot of work and energy to maintain relationships where there are people in our lives that we can call on to help us when we're in trouble, that we can be vulnerable around. And it's not something that only queer community needs, but it's something that marginalized communities like queer communities often have less of.
Yeah.
And so when we think about how to create community, oftentimes we find that tapping on relationships people already have and figuring out how to strengthen them and how to bring people to a place of shared values and radically open and honest communication is much more effective than trying to bring strangers together and forge superficial connections that might not last past the event that we're hosting.
Yeah.
So and organizations sometimes we play very limited roles. We're not in people's day-to-day lives. We can't promote supportive conversations among people, and I think a lot of this means that community members and organizations have to work together to create the kind of communities we want to see, because they all start with these one-on-one relationships. It's not like we can just create a community out of people who don't know each other or who are not already connected. So that's something I learned from the community work we've done, is that community building work is often put on a pedestal or romanticized, wow, we're creating these amazing connections between people. But the reality is we can only build where there is fertile soil. And so if people already have these relationships, all we can do is try and create more space for people to come together, more public space, more safe spaces. But people have to do their own work to connect. And, we can share political tools. We can create workshops on transformative justice. We can create spaces where there's a ready-made container, but people have to walk into the container, and it's a lot of work. It's very long-term.
That was Luka Cai, Executive Director of the St. Louis Queer Support Helpline, or SQSH. They were discussing the challenging yet rewarding work of community building for and among queer St. Louisans. We need to take a quick break, but we'll hear more of this conversation about SQSH, including how hyper-trans visibility can be a double-edged sword. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Let's get back to the conversation between Luka Cai, Executive Director of St. Louis Queer Support Helpline, also known as SQSH, and producer Maya Norfleet.
You mentioned some of the things that you've learned in this work. What are some of those other lessons that only during the practice of, having a helpline, connecting people to resources, just just listening to people talk about what they need or dream of or would love to have. What else have y'all or, has Squish learned?
I think one that often our programs are a bit of a band-aid solution. So, we're able to provide emotional support in a phone call. We're able to provide connections or information about resources, or we can maybe convene a group of people to talk about LGBTQ topics for the first time in their neighborhood or their community. But oftentimes the systems that make it life difficult for people in our community are all very intersectional, they're interwoven, and it's very hard to take them down. So I think thinking about this work long term is really important, getting people to invest in the St. Louis region and staying here. A lot of trans people and queer people are leaving and moving because this is not a good place for them to stay. And I feel both like that's very understandable, especially for trans youth and their families. But it's also very sad. I think it's very tragic. And we need people to be able to invest in the region and in the work long term. We need this to be sustainable and resourced work. We need philanthropy to shift to better value community-based grassroots work and LGBTQ issue area work, and also to see all of the issues that as intersectional. So like our work cannot exist on its own without reproductive justice work or racial justice work or anti-capitalist work. So it's like this work is both really hard and also needs to be much more sustainable and requires much more collaboration and systems-based thinking than we initially expected. Connecting across lived experience and across privileged and marginalized identities is really difficult. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we see in our community, and it creates a lot of conflict, resentment, and also lack of power dynamics that need to shift aren't being shifted because of I think it's really common to see people experience feelings of defensiveness, guilt when confronted with privilege, myself included. And I really admire some of the work that organizations like NCCJ and Forward Through Ferguson are doing to create spaces where people can communicate across privilege and marginalization. And one thing I've seen that is sort of discouraging is I think when a community member's experience is so drastically different, every aspect of their life is different from a more privileged person trying to understand their experience. It just takes so much exhaustion and having to explain things over and over again. It takes a lot to communicate the entirety of someone's experience. But we also see on a more hopeful end that when people have empathy, have relationships with marginalized community members, genuine mutually beneficial relationships, and a genuine desire to learn across difference, that people with more privilege have also shown up in ways that are supportive. So being humble, listening, being active about shifting power and resources, forming relationships where, in a society that can be very fragmented, usually relationships across social identity are rare. It's more rare than relationships with people who share your social identities.
Right.
So we do see that it can happen, and it can be very transformative, I think, because ideally coalition work and movement work is, cross-racial, it's multiracial, it's multi-identity, multi-gender. I wish more people were bought into doing this kind of work, and also I think capitalism makes it difficult to have energy and time for people who might be having it worse.
It seems like you have a problem with capitalism. It'd be great if you can kind of explain what capitalism has to do with queerness and queer liberation and queer identity.
Great question. And I'm not an expert on this, so this is just...
I'm not expecting you to be. I'm asking you.
So I think what I've seen in my work is that part of the philosophy of capitalism centers profit over people. And so that gives businesses, corporations, organizations, sometimes even nonprofits, the incentive to grow bigger and bigger without considering what other factors are valuable to consider in the process. So prioritizing profit over things like sustainability, climate justice, people's energy,
or even like a sense of belonging,
community. And so, that affects everyone, and it affects marginalized communities who already have least access to resources. It also makes it very difficult for us to invest in long-term work because it's not profitable. So work that takes a long time, like building a neighborhood of people who care about each other, or caring about people who are aging, but we're no longer able to work under capitalism, so they're not producing profit or something
people
of
not
value.
old enough to work.
Exactly, younger people as well. And so under capitalism, I think people with the most earning power, or the power to control resources for the sake of profit, like large corporations, people leading large corporations, they benefit from the system. And then the people least able to contribute to profit, some of our most marginalized people, disabled people, queer and trans people. There's even, the logic of capitalism also impacts the way that governments and societies think about how much we should reproduce. Like the more you can reproduce, the more people are generated for labor under capitalism.
And when you say reproduce, you're talking about like reproducing, like sexually, like
like
other humans. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And under capitalism, like queer and trans people are not profitable. Like many of us don't reproduce in cisgender heterosexual ways. Many of us, there's a large intersection between trans people and neurodivergent people, and also disabled people. So it's very hard to be productive when there are all of those layers of marginalization. And so I think the core idea I'm trying to convey here is it's difficult to center social justice when the economic system centers profit, which is social justice is often very not profitable.
Yeah, but if to put it in economic terms, the profit is what? Like, if the point isn't to make more money, it's not profitable, and you know that. What are we gaining by having such programs and resources like Squish?
I think we gain more sustainable and joyful communities to live in. I think we gain more justice in the sense that we're doing the right thing for the society we live in. I think we gain a sense of full participation from everyone in our community, especially those most marginalized. I think we gain a sense of everyone's full humanity. We're not seeing each other through the lens of stereotypes or myths or flattened understandings of each other. And I think there will be more time, space, and energy for things we joyfully like to do together. And I think that will benefit everyone, not just queer communities.
The legislation that has been focused, maybe some people can even say targeted towards trans people, and I'm talking like children and adults, remains a huge talking point. Even though the legislature session is over, there's a lot still to be said, and we're still seeing some of the repercussions of those bills, or even of the conversations being had in the Capitol. What are the types of concerns that people are sharing with you with Squish, and how does Squish hope to help in what they need?
Yeah. This is an example where visibility or hypervisibility of our community is a double-edged sword. So, for many years, the mainstream LGBT movement has asked for more visibility for LGBTQ people, from having Pride Month, parades, asking to be seen and to be heard. But I think what's really unfortunate, is a politicization of trans people's bodies, lives, in ways that can be very invading of individual trans people's privacy. Trans people's right to gender-affirming healthcare, I think, is something that I am very passionate about, and our community is very passionate about. But for it to be under such a national spotlight, and to be, we've received a lot of hateful rhetoric, and a lot of, oftentimes it's over social media or on platforms where it's difficult to have transformative or engaging dialogue. And so under this kind of really politicized atmosphere. I think it has created a lot of fear, insecurity, anxiety, and people calling being really scared about the social political climate. We see queer and trans people and families leaving the state if they have the resources, or feeling heightened sense of danger from the people around them, not being sure who is supportive. And I think even people in the middle about trans issues have been impacted by, I would say, a lot of the misinformation. For example, Jamie Reed's affidavit about the WashU Trans Center, I think contains a lot of myths around the amount of autonomy trans youth have, and the amount of there's so many safety checks and balances that go into gender affirming healthcare already that honestly already make it pretty onerous process. It's already difficult to get through all the red tape. It takes months and months for someone to even be able to access hormones, and much less gender affirming surgery. I will say for me that gender affirming healthcare has saved my life. And so being able to be on hormones and to be able to see a gender affirming healthcare provider at Southampton has been one of the biggest reasons why I am lucky to be here, and also lucky to be in St. Louis. St. Louis is a community I care a lot about, and part of that is the grassroots network of healthcare providers, community organizers, and community members who work together to try and continue access to gender affirming healthcare for our community. So in short, I would say I think it's really unfair, and it's very intentional that this issue is being used as a political pawn for anti-trans politicians to be able to win votes and able to push this issue along in the Capitol. And it really shouldn't be, when there are so many other pressing social issues that everyone faces.
That was Luka Cai, Executive Director of the St. Louis Queer Support Helpline, speaking with producer Maya Norfleet. For more information about the helpline, visit thesquish.org. That's THESQSH.org.
This episode was produced, recorded, and edited by Maya Norfleet.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.